Hello, my name is Stephanie Duarte, and this is my Burke audiovisual assignment for class POT 3003. So in order to get started with this assignment, we have to start from the very beginning. And the very beginning is, according to quote 1, Burke believed that the French Revolution essentially represented the end of civilization. So as we discussed in class, the French Revolution was essentially built on rights. The Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizens, and essentially adopted by the French National Assembly and given to everyone regardless of their social standing. Now in quote 2, it is stated that government is the contrivance of human wisdom in order for human wants. In addition to that, in quote 2, Burke presents his critique of the government and essentially states that government is needed in order to convert human rights into reality. Not only that, but government is needed to protect human rights, and its main function is to police human rights. And in doing that, making sure that no one's rights get trampled in the process. Now, in quote 3, Burke establishes that the government's role depends on the understanding of practical realities and essentially deciding between the needs and the wants of human beings requires some form of wisdom. And when talking about some form of wisdom, essentially he's saying practical wisdom. Now, in our class discussion, we learned that Burke goes on to talk about those individuals who have practical wisdom and should be in government. And he breaks these individuals up into 3 distinct categories within epistemology, which essentially refers to the theory of knowledge and refers to how you know. And these 3 distinct categories are intellectually or nous, manually or techni, practically or phronesis. And Burke essentially states that practically and phronesis is the most equipped to go into government because of their practical wisdom. However, taking a step back, we have to define these 3 distinct categories. So the first category is intellectually or nous, and this refers to what we know intellectually. And manually or techni refers to a manual skill that requires a technical understanding on how exactly things work. And then practically or phronesis refers to a way of practically knowing. Now in quote 4, Burke further establishes this notion by stating that there is no one in government or politics in France that has this practical knowledge or wisdom present. Now, moving on to what the French Revolution did not know according to Burke. In quote 5, Burke alludes to believing and respecting that social complexity is moral. And essentially, he states how individuals who don't find their scheme of politics and have not adapted to the state of the world in which they live in come to think very lightly of the public principle and in turn abandon interest in what they had found valuable before. As we also discussed in class, the French Revolution did not know that theory must adapt to reality and not the other way around. Now, through quote 6, we can see that Burke believes that the French Revolution essentially failed because of one thing. It failed because they tried to remove natural hierarchy. And Burke believes that essentially removing natural hierarchy perverts the natural order of things. And to explain this, he provides an analogy which states that something that should be built on the ground is essentially being built in the air, which doesn't really make sense. Next, Burke moves on to talk about some ideas about reforming the revolution, and he starts with these ideas through quote 7, where he states that a state without some change is without means on its conservation, and the preservation of the Constitution is then put at risk as a result. Therefore, we can conclude that some change is needed. Next, through quote 8, Burke then highlights how a well-wrought veil over every circumstance that had a negative tendency is necessary, or in other words, a good thing. And what he means by this is a political veil, meaning that a cover essentially hides all the bad from the citizens and essentially just focuses on the good. Now, as we discussed in class, a political veil is necessary because essentially the past puts a weight on us, according to Burke, and the beautiful essentially softens the harshness of the world. Therefore, a political veil is something that's good. Now, through quote 9, Burke introduces the term entailed inheritance, where essentially he establishes that our Constitution preserves a unity in so great of a diversity of its parts through this. Now, in class, we discussed the stadial account of history. And as you can see here, we have manners, time, stages. So we go from savagery to barbarism to civilization. and hunting, pasture, agriculture, commerce. And so when we apply this to the scenario at hand, given the French Revolution, through quote 10, Burke highlights that the way that the king and the queen of France were assassinated with great detail by a band of ruffians and assassins highlights how we've essentially gone from civilization all the way back to savagery through essentially quote 10. Now, through quote 11, as well as the discussions that we've had in class, we can establish that Burke believes that humans have destroyed human institutions and have gone back from civilization all the way back to savagery, as we previously stated. Now, through this, we can see that Burke essentially feels much better about the American Revolution than he does about the French Revolution. And essentially, this is because within the American Revolution, it was all about maintaining the political system as well as all of the entailed inheritance, with a major focus in moving slow and preserving things. While in terms of the French Revolution, it quite literally did the opposite. It overthrew the political system, moved fast, and by moving fast, also broke things along the way in Burke's eyes. The assassination of the king and queen was essentially a step in the wrong direction in Burke's eyes, and Burke saw this as humans destroying human institutions and, like I previously stated, going from a sense of civilization all the way back to savagery. Now, when it comes to whether or not I agree with Burke's assessments and essentially his ideas that he's put forth, yes, I do. I think after reading the reflections on the Revolution in France, as well as all the in-class discussions and lectures, I think I was able to accurately see exactly what he was trying to say and essentially relate it back to my life and the current, our current day environment within the world. So, as highlighted within quote 2, the government is in place to protect human rights, and in addition to that, prevent others' rights from being trampled. Not only that, but government is a contrivance of human wisdom to provide for human wants, and I completely agree with this. I think even one of the class discussions that we had of whether or not we think a surgeon or a mechanic should be in charge of drafting up our Constitution, I completely agree that it should be someone that has practical knowledge, not necessarily just knowing that of what a surgeon does or that what a mechanic does, because they're not getting the full picture and essentially they're not being able to advocate for everyone entirely. So I think after that that discussion that we had, I completely agree with Burke in the sense that it has to be someone that has that accurate wisdom and practical knowledge to be able to take on that role and decide. Now, as highlighted in quote 6, I agree that the French Revolution essentially failed because they removed their natural hierarchy. I believe it does disrupt the natural order of things, as we discussed in class. I remember in class we discussed about the nobility and the church and essentially what it does for us. And I think before the discussion, I was really on the fence, but now after the discussion, I've kind of solidified that, okay, so nobility kind of gives us a point where we want to relate to them or we want to be them or we want to be more like them. And then the church aspect of the natural hierarchy essentially makes us do things because we fear another outcome, or essentially we're a good person because we fear the negative consequence or things like that of that nature. So yes, I would also agree with this assessment that Burke made. Now, in quote 8, Burke discussed that we need a political veil because the past puts a large weight on us, and essentially the beautiful softens the harshness of the world. And I completely agree with this as well. I think a political veil is necessary in terms of keeping individuals and citizens illusioned with the world. I think as a kid in elementary school, learning about history and learning about the government, I in a way idolized these individuals, and unfortunately now that I know more and as I've gone through college, you learn so much more, and the political veil essentially kind of just fades and you become disillusioned with what you originally thought was true. So I think the political veil and the argument that Burke is making is very, very valid, and I completely agree with it. Lastly, through quote 10 and 11, I agree with the determination that Burke made that humans essentially destroyed humans' institutions and went back from civilization all the way back to savagery. I think we've evolved much more than going in and raiding a castle and killing a queen and a king. I think that slow change, as Burke says, is the best way to preserve things. And by moving fast, chaos ensues and things break. And just like he mentioned, during the French Revolution, they moved fast and essentially things broke. So I do agree with that assessment as well, and I think it still reigns true today. And it's easy to picture. So therefore, I do agree with Burke's assessments.